Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today we got Dr. Adair, the author of the Bethlehem Star, A Skeptical View, which you can get on Amazon right now. It's in the link in the description. Buy a copy; it's a great book. And you are also a data scientist, so you're into math, objective truth, facts, logic, all that stuff.
Yeah, data scientist by day, and don't think I've mentioned this before as well. I also have a research affiliateship with MIT, so I'm able to continue some of my physics and education research with a bunch of really good people and powerful resources. So fingers in
Nice.
many pies.
Nice. I noticed that we have a string of super chats that already are starting to pop up, and I'm not going to forget about you. I do want to get to this presentation. So please, thank you for those, everybody who's submitted those, and we will get to those. And yeah, whenever you're ready, your floor is yours.
Superb. All right. So I have been leaving some breadcrumbs of a mystery that I've been working on about this title that Jesus has, where he is called the Morningstar, in particular, twice in the book of Revelation, in 2 Peter, the pseudo letter of the Apostle Peter. And no one seems to have a good explanation for this sort of thing. What I'm going to be presenting is actually some material that I also plan on presenting later this year at the Society of Biblical Literature, which also means a lot of this stuff has not yet gone through like the peer review process. So I am extremely welcoming of critique and criticism. So if you send super chats, start them with the subject line, "Hey, stupid." Send me emails, subject line, "Hey, stupid." So that way it gets my attention and I pay attention to the many mistakes I may have made.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right. So Morningstars, before we even get to Christianity, that was a part of a lot of mythemes for thousands of years. Inanna and Ishtar, that myth, extremely ancient, including the myth of going down into the underworld.
No one's dying, are they?
Somebody.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. When it comes to Inanna and Ishtar, a lot of people get into trouble.
Yeah.
Similarly, actually, also with Aphrodite, a lot of her consorts or lovers also tend to have a bad go of things. And it's also worth noting that Aphrodite and Venus also have some interesting connections also to dying and rising god systems. So Aphrodite has a relation with Adonis, who also seems to be a dying and rising god. At least by the 2nd century AD, we have very clear references to that.
And a lot of scholars, especially like the Frasers, those type of people, they like to identify Dumuzi with Adonis. So I don't know what's. I think there's a lot there. I'm not really sure right now off the top of my head, but I'm sure you might.
Yeah. Oh, in part because Adonis, I think the word actually comes from the same as the Hebrew word Adonai, meaning Lord.
Lord, right? And then in the Metamorphosis, Ovid likes to point out that Adonis is the ruler of the East.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, giving a nod to it's his origins, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So he seems to fit the same sort of typology, and it's only later, like classical sources, they're absolutely clear that Adonis was a dying and rising god, that he also would basically be rescued from the underworld, and also had this love relationship with Aphrodite in the same way Dumuzi did with Inanna, Tammuz with Ishtar. Of course, also when it comes to the cult of Julius Caesar, Caesar was taken up to heaven by Venus/Aphrodite, so she seems to be involved with a lot of interesting folks who get immortalized one way or the other.
What's funny is I just recently read the Adonis Venus myth where he dies. She's teaching about. She tells him this long story about this guy who gets killed by a bear or something like that, and she's basically telling him not to be a hunter, don't go out and do this crazy stuff. And then if she leaves for like 2 seconds, and then he goes out and tries to hunt a boar, and gets killed.
Yep.
It's kind of funny actually, but it's like, but the reason why I bring this up is I noticed something, that her mourning over him and her tears grows a plant that comes out of him every year. I think it is every springtime. Anyways, I thought this. I don't know if this is other people have thought of this, but this is my own personal take. Was that your death, your resurrection in this universe depends on if you leave a good enough mark in this world on the people that you love, their remembering you will be your living on, your eternal life. So like you live in the minds of the people that you leave behind. That to me was a profound, and I'm not sure if that's what Ovid meant or whoever wrote this myth. I'm not sure if this is what they were going for, but it certainly struck me that way. If that makes sense.
It's the point that M. David Litwell has made that basically anyone who is a god or becomes a god must have done some sort of great deeds to become
Yeah.
worthy of that. So I see it in that vein. But when it comes to us, our best chance of being immortal is leaving a good mark that makes us worth remembering and
Right.
influence the future that way. That's the closest I'm going to have to immortality. And
That's what I was saying. That's what I'm
yeah,
saying. She loved him so much, and she was mourning him so much that her love for him brought him resurrection. Because in a literal sense, she was he lives on through her memory.
mhm. Yeah. Oh boy, we're already getting deep and philosophical.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do it. Oh, go ahead.
All right. I would just quickly mention that there's also a few other references to the Morning Star that also may be a little bit more hidden. So, for example, Dionysus, god of wine. But interestingly enough, in one of the plays of Aristophanes, The Frogs, there's this scene where there are these cultists who basically are part of the Bacchic cult. They're doing this nighttime ritual, and they seem to refer to Dionysus as Phosphoros Aster, light bearing or morning star. Phosphoros is the word you would use for the morning star, and they're using that to refer to Dionysus. So seems like there also might be some connection there. By the way, in the Frogs, what does Dionysus do? He goes to Hades to bring back one of the playwrights of Athens to bring him back to the world of the living, so they can basically give a rebirth to culture to Athens.
Wow.
So again, kind of acting like Aphrodite or Ishtar going to the underworld and bringing someone back from the world of the dead.
Yeah, and this happens a lot in Greek mythology. You got
Mhm.
Hercules goes down there. I'm not sure if he brings anyone back, but he definitely goes down there,
Yeah.
causes some trouble, and then comes back up again.
Oh
You
yeah. There's one myth where he actually brings back Theseus from hell.
Oh, okay, there you go. Yeah, that's I was thinking of that. And then, but then you have like attempts that fail. You have
Mhm.
Orpheus goes down there to bring back Eurycleia,
Mhm.
and he fails. He turns around and looks at her, and then she falls down the fucking whatever it is. But like,
Yeah.
there's this reoccurring motif in Greek mythology of going down to the underworld and trying to bring back the dead. This sort of
Yeah. Or at least
Demeter and
yeah.
Persephone. There's another. That's probably
Yeah.
the biggest example of all.
Yeah. Heck, even Odysseus takes a trip to the underworld to get some advice. He doesn't bring people back to life, but he makes the trip. So
Yes.
basically, if you're going to do anything important, it might as well be in hell.
Yeah, and that's surely where that, and these are the preceding myths of the Greek world before Christianity. And
Mhm.
I mean, like that's an obvious point. Like obviously, like what does that mean? Well, it makes sense that Christianity would become so popular so quick, not so quick, but over time,
Yeah.
because these people are already looking for a savior, someone that's gonna raise them up, and they're already worried about hell and all that stuff. They're already thinking about eternal lives and all this. This is already a sort of like embedded within the culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And one last cultural point, at least in the not Jewish Christian world, in Mithraism, there are these common characters you'll see in any sort of representation known as kotis and katopates. They're holding these torches. One of them is pointing upward, one of them is pointing downward. And scholars have argued whether it's supposed to be referring to like sunrise and sunset, the solstices, or maybe even the morning and evening star. So it could also be the case that the Morning Star is also at least slightly connected to the Mithraic cult, but that's not totally clear.
Yeah.
And of course, when it comes to the Jewish and Christian religion, well, specifically in Christianity, you find Jesus being called the Morning Star and Satan.
Right. Lucifer.
So,
Well, yeah, it's
yeah.
Lucifer though, right?
Well, Lucifer is just the Latin name for the Morning Star.
Sure. And then
And
Satan is just the Hebrew word for the accuser.
mhm.
And what the question is, how do those two get combined?
Oh yeah, yeah. What we see, like for example, in the Gospel of Luke, he seems to be referring to the fall of Satan, and he seems to be doing this in reference to the uh, fall of Hillel ben Shakar in Isaiah 14:12. It seems
Right.
to be that sort of influence. And in particular, in the Latin translation, Hillel ben Shakar becomes known as Lucifer. And ultimately, that then, because people are reading this as the fall of
I see.
Satan,
So it's
and
it's
now
the
he's been called
Latin.
that.
It's in Latin.
Yeah.
Is that's when it happens by the time Latin becomes Bible.
Mhm.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the question then becomes, how do we go from these morning stars to Jesus as a morning star? How do we get from there to there? And, why give this title to Jesus and then, of course, get confused and also give it to Satan? That just makes it really weird. Are Jesus and Satan the same person? Probably not. That'd be a very hard theology to hold on to. But the thing is, I'm not the first person to notice that this is actually a weird problem. One classicist scholar by the name of Colin Hemmer, he's pretty famous for like this long commentary he had written for the Book of Acts. He died before finishing it, but it's one of the major sources out there. But he also wrote this important book on Revelation and the context of the letters that were sent to. And he basically notes, there have been lots and lots of proposals over the years to explain this, and none of them really work.
Right.
He basically says there's lots of them and they stink. He uses more scholarly words than that, but basically noting none of them really fit. The most common one probably is the citation of what's called the star prophecy from Numbers 24:17. It was a super popular prophecy to interpret. We see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Christians cite it a lot. But the thing is, it just talks about a star rising. There's nothing there that says specifically a morning star. How do you go from star to a very specific kind of star? That is left completely unexplained. Others then looking to like the imperial cult because of the connections that Venus might have with the Caesarean cult. Sometimes like there's some poetry that refers to the Emperor Domitian as the morning star arriving. So is that what's going on? Maybe it goes somehow relates to Babylonian religion with the cults of Inanna Ishtar, but
Right.
it all gets a bit speculative. There isn't like that direct line. So Hemmer basically says it was clearly in the background understanding of the Christians who were reading this so well that it didn't have to be explained. But I don't like unexplained mysteries, so
Right.
how might we do this? And so I'm going to propose the way forward is, can we find any other examples of the morning star in Jewish or early Christian literature, find something in common, and see what we can deduce that might explain that? And interestingly enough, I've actually found two other Jewish or likely Jewish sources that refer to the morning star doing amazing things. So, in particular, in the Sibylline Oracles in Book 5, which is usually dated to like about the 130s AD, it first refers to earlier on this great star that will boil away all the oceans. Why is that important? Basically, the sea is seen as like this enemy of God. In fact, at the end of Revelation, one of the things it notes is that in the new heavens and new earth, there will be no ocean, there will be no sea. It'll be all done away with because it's deadly, it's full of sea monsters, it's got to go.
Yeah.
And later on, where specifically we are told about the morning star in battle in the heavens, like fighting all the constellations, and in particular is attacks the constellation Aquarius and boils him up. Again, something watery. So that great star and this morning star seem to be the same object. And again, doing the same sort of thing that Jesus is supposed to do in like the book of Revelation, where he's the morning star. He apparently destroys the oceans and destroys all the other cosmic forces to rule the universe.
Right.
In another, go ahead.
I was going to say, what's interesting about that is later on in Revelation, I'm not sure which, I can't think of what chapter it is, but it's towards the end. It's one of the later chapters. It talks about Hades giving up its dead, the dead giving up its dead, and the sea giving up its dead, which a lot of people probably read right past that. It's just, it was just it's Revelation, just some weird shit like the rest of the book. But if you actually read Greek mythology, you'll know that that's something that happens in the Odyssey, where Hades and the sea, or Poseidon, the god of the sea, and Zeus are like basically talking over who's can have souls. Like those are the three main gods that have a different realms. They're in charge of their own realms. So the only ones that can give up dead are those three people. There's three gods. So it's funny how they say it like that. Hades gave up its dead. Death gave up its dead. Those are two different characters in Greek mythology, by the way. Why would it say in Greek it would say Hades gave up its dead, Hades gave up its dead, right? Isn't that what it says? Or is it really talking about two different Like, to me, it doesn't even make sense. But like, for trying to make it make sense, I think you have to go through Greek mythology. I think it's a Hellenistic phrase.
Well, yeah, when you start using words like Hades and Tartarus, then yeah, you are using
Right.
the mythic mindset that the Greeks had already established.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. I mean, I could be wrong, but whatever.
And that's at least a good starting premise as far as
Yeah,
I'm concerned.
it's what it's not. It's just what it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's also this interesting Jewish novel called Joseph and Aseneth. It's basically telling the story about when Joseph is living in Egypt. This woman, who's an Egyptian woman by the name of Aseneth, basically completely falls in love with Joseph and converts from paganism or pagan Egyptian religion to Judaism. And basically, the story of her transformation, conversion, and marriage to Joseph. And this basically the midpoint of the novel, she is like praying like day and night. She's in sackcloth and mourning, and then finally, after several days, she sees the morning star rising on the horizon and says, "Oh, the great messenger has come." Messenger, by the way, is the same word in Greek for angel. And then all of a sudden, right by the morning star, the heavens split open, light pouring out, and then all of a sudden, there's this angel basically right hovering above her head, speaking to her. And then the angel like basically says, "Fear not, good stuff is happening." Blesses her, goes through some interesting ritual acts, and then when he disappears, he appears to shoot off in a flaming chariot back to the east.
Wow.
So it's pretty much saying, hey, the morning star is an angel. That angel came and had things to do with Aseneth for her conversion. And the interesting details is that this figure is human looking, and apparently is wearing regal clothing. He says that he's basically the commander of the heavenly armies.
It
So
sounds like
basically,
Michael.
yeah, he sounds almost like the Archangel Michael in many ways.
Yeah, because Michael was like the angel of the war, of like the war, right? That's what he's supposed. That's his like main, I guess, purpose is
Yeah,
to
well,
go lead the army against Satan at the end of times.
yeah, in the war in heaven in like Revelation 12, it's Michael who actually fights off and sends
Right.
Satan and his minions to out of the sky. So
Interesting.
yeah, he's the first line of kicking butt and taking names.
By the way, are you familiar with Zoroastrianism at all? Have you read any of the text?
A fair bit.
Because in the Zendavesta, it's Mithra who's basically like Michael. Mithra is known as he invokes Mithra to fight against these devas. And Mithra is actually I have it right next to me because I was just talking to someone about this, and I'll read it to you. But it sounds like Mithra is like a I think maybe Michael might have been influenced by the Zoroastrian Mithra, not the Roman Mithras, because this Mithras is like an angel. This Mithras is not like God, but he's like and he invokes him and says that he says something along the lines of, this is the God who has all the weapons. Like, he's like a warrior god in this. He's not the same as the Mithras in Roman mythology. It's a different type of Mithras.
Oh yeah.
But I'll try to find it, but you can continue.
Yeah. So right now, in the two sources that I have, the Sibling Oracles and Joseph and Aseneth, these are what most scholars at least think are Jewish sources describing basically a figure that's either comes from or is the morning star and has basically the powers of a king, ruler, something that can basically wage wars. And
Right.
interestingly, in some other sources, like in the Testament of Levi, there's also this high priest, this like heavenly high priest who is also called a bright star. And the thing is, in Hebrew, bright star is pretty much the same as morning star. It says right in Revelation when Jesus says, "I am the bright star, the morning star."
I found it, by the way.
Oh, cool.
And hold that thought. It says, I invoke Mithra, the lord of wide pastures, a god armed with beautiful weapons, with the most glorious of all weapons, the fiend smiting of all weapons. Like, this is some other type of Mithra. I don't know. It doesn't sound like the Mithra we think about when we think of Mithra slaying the bull. Well, maybe, but I don't know. I just thought that's interesting how he says that. It just comes out of nowhere.
Oh yeah.
It just comes
Oh
out of
yeah.
nowhere.
Yeah.
It's just like, I'm gonna give Mithra on your ass. He's face to face with Angramanu. I'm gonna get Mithra on your ass. He's got the weapons of all weapons. Like, what
I
the?
guess it's similar in what is it, Pulp Fiction? I'm going to get medieval on your ass. This is the
Yeah,
same equivalent thing.
yeah, right. But yeah, back to what you're saying with the Morningstar.
Yeah, yeah. So we now have also this highly priest figure that also is like this bright star in heaven. And again, bright star is actually the way that in Hebrew you refer to Venus, the morning star. The planet Venus in Hebrew is actually called bright star when you translate.
Wow.
So when it talks about the high priest being this bright star, that could also be in reference to him being a morning star. It isn't 100% clear, but it's the sort of connection you would make. And also, interestingly, there's another priest in the book of Sirach. A priest is leaving the holy temple in Jerusalem, and he's doing this on Yom Kippur. So he's just come out, doing the necessary sacrifices, and it describes him while he's still like behind the veil as looking like the morning star in the clouds because he's so bright and brilliant looking.
I think that's interesting how in Isaiah 14, the way he describes it is like a falling from a high point.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about the Babylonian king.
Yes.
The title gives him the title of Hallel. So I wonder if this is like just like an sort of an ancient pun or an ancient title, like a sort of a phrase that you would say, like, like you fell from grace, like, but like this is like a different way of saying that you fell.
Oh, that's actually what we, at least what I argued in an earlier video, saying that I think it might be a pun on a similar Hebrew word to basically means boast.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, so it's like, oh, you're the brilliant boaster. Well, you can boast in hell.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
All right. So main sum up here is that the various places that I find the morning star as reference to or comparison with keep showing up either as a kingly, regal sort of figure or a high priest, or actually in some ways both, because sometimes they even do the same sort of function, that they do priestly duties and destroy the forces of evil.
Nice.
So this is actually an interesting combination. And also, if we're going to say looking for sources, maybe we've also been finding that source in another place, and we just didn't realize it the whole time. At least I'm going to argue that might also be in the background for the Star of Bethlehem story. So the phrase that is used to describe the star twice is this Greek phrase ente anatole. And you will actually find this is like one of the few things that the translations don't agree on in chapter 2 of the gospel. In most older translations, it'll say in the east, while more recent translations tend to instead translate it as at its rising or when it rose. There's ambiguity because the word anatole comes from the verb anatello, which means to rise. So this is the rising. Well, where do things rise? In the east. So it has that sort of ambiguity to it. On the other hand, it's also a really strange phrase with the use of the word en. So it's like saying in the rising. That, obviously sounds weird to us in English. And when I tried looking for examples of this sort of phrase in other Greek literature, I was actually surprised how rare it ever shows up, besides people just quoting the Gospel of Matthew. So in particular, when I limited myself just to astronomical texts, I basically only found 2 examples. One from an astrological text allegedly written by Manetho, and then the astronomical text of Ptolemy, the Almagest, in its original Greek form.
Right. Obviously, that's got to have something on there.
Yeah. Like I say, this phrase of ente anatole or en anatole without the definite article, extremely rare combination. And in these 2 places I found, it was actually rather specific. It was specific to the first rising of a planet just before sunrise. In other words, of its first morning rising. So this would suggest that sort of syntax is used for a morning star. There are also a few Christian sources that seem to be absolutely explicit about this. One person in the 6th century, Apriginus, who's writing in Latin, Ephraim, who's writing in Syriac, they are absolutely explicit that this star was the morning star. They said that just straight out. Gregory of Nyssa, he's writing in Greek, and he's a bit interesting. So instead of reproducing the phrase ente anatole, he uses this other Greek word epitole. That doesn't sound like much, but if you read the textbooks that astronomy students had to read, they would actually tell you the scientific term for the first rising of a star in the morning is epitole. So the fact he's using the scientific technical term for this in replacement for it seems to suggest he thinks the 2 are similar enough.
Right. Now, did you already talk about the star of Aeneas yet?
Oh, not yet. But the interesting thing there is, I think also Matthew is trying to use this as background for his leading star, because the star of Aeneas is supposed to lead the Trojans from the fallen Troy to their new homeland in Rome. And in the older sources before the Aeneid, Virgil, we're actually told that this original myth was actually not just any star leading them, it was specifically Aphrodite as Lucifer. That's actually in the Latin text
Wow.
specifying it was Lucifer
Which is
that led them. Yeah.
And Venus, by
So,
the way, Venus is the comet
mhm.
that Julius Caesar was ascended to during his apotheosis, which led to this coin, Divius Aelius, the divine son of Julius, which is Augustus, son of
Mhm.
God. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. I feel like it should be noted that this
Oh
is a
yeah.
symbol. This was a symbol that people knew.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so my thought is, I already think Matthew is probably using the Aeneas myth to act as background of this leading star to the new king of the Jews. And if it's even more specific, that it's a morning star in leading them in both cases, that I think adds more evidence that that's what Matthew was trying to communicate.
Doesn't Matthew also borrow from a text that is about Mithridates' birth?
So we are told that Mithridates had a comet appear at his birth and at his coronation, in
And
the
then
years of
there
his
was,
coronation.
and I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was Magi showing up too.
Um,
Or no?
Not directly.
Okay,
So
never mind.
it's a little bit confusing. So it looks like any king in the Zoroastrian faith would also go through the mysteries of the Magi and basically become a Magi themselves. So you could say this is the birth of a king slash priest slash magus. So that gets a little bit mixed in there. And also, it is worth noting Mithridates did include coins which had the comet on there to, also say, to keep using this as part of his own propaganda.
Have you ever played Morrowind for Elder Scrolls
Mm-mm.
3? Well,
I unfortunately am a what's the right term? Philistine when it comes to video games these days.
anyone that's watched that, who can listen to this right now or watch this, whenever I think of Zoroastrian Magi, I don't know why, my brain goes right to the mages in that game with like the big
Hmm.
purple hats, that like the Harry Potter hats, like with like the cloaks. I don't know why my brain does that, but it just does. Anyways, my bad.
All right. All right. So this and other reasons I've come to think that maybe the best way of interpreting this phrase in Matthew is to actually say the star at Jesus' birth was not just a star, but specifically a morning star.
Hmm.
Which means that we have yet one more reference to a morning star related to Jesus. Of course, the problem there uh, is Jesus the star, or is there just a star at his birth?
I've had another scholar who was his specialty was Danielic literature and revelation, told me that there was very early. I think you have it. I think Ignatius is one of them. I think that's why you have his
Hmm.
name there. His commentary is that Venus is the interpretation of this symbol of the woman in Revelation 12.
I don't want to get too far ahead, Joe.
Okay, my bad. Go ahead. Come back to where you were.
Yeah. So yeah, I do mention Ignatius here because he, along with Second Peter, along with Revelation, are all looks like calling Jesus a star, a bright star, the morning star. Over and over again, Jesus is absolutely stellar. But in Matthew, it seems clear the star is a different body than Jesus. The star leads to his birthplace. Um,
Right.
on the other hand, there's this other apocryphal gospel called the Revelation of the Magi. We can tell it's derived from the Gospel of Matthew. It clearly knows it. But it's also weird because it basically says the star and Jesus are the same object.
Hmm.
It literally has a star first greeting the Magi while they are in the east. I think in the land of Shinar. They go up to a mountain, and the star basically descends into a cave, and then appears before them and says, "I'm also being born right now in Bethlehem at the same time." So apparently, the star is polymorphic. It's bilocating. It can be two places and be two different things at once.
Wow.
And again, this 6th century commentator, I keep mispronouncing, Aprigius, He says explicitly that the Star of Bethlehem is the morning star. And he also, of course, will say that Jesus is the morning star because that's what it says in Revelation. So, transitive property. If Jesus is morning star and morning star is Star of Bethlehem, then Jesus is the Star of Bethlehem. That's weird.
Yeah.
So, what is going on here? So, there's two ways we might think about this. Is it the case that all of these sources are not dependent on each other or depend on something in common, but there's basically two different ideas going out there? One, there's a star at Jesus's birth, or Jesus is a star. So I'm going to suggest like two models we might want to have in mind. The one on the right is probably the model I think most Bible scholars would have coming out of seminary or professionally. So that there might be these two different ideas out there. The one of Jesus being some stellar body of some sort, and Matthew deriving ultimately from the star prophecy of Numbers 24:17, and then Revelation. A lot of people think there's a relationship between Matthew and Revelation. For example, in Dennis MacDonald's book on the Dionysian Gospel, he talks about various Johannine literature. Just for a short bit, talks about Revelation and says he thinks the evidence points to Revelation using Matthew as a source, and others have thought that as well. The evidence that there's a relationship is good, but we'll discuss that more later. Also, most people will use Ignatius as a way to help date Matthew because they would think that Ignatius seems to quote Matthew, has a lot of the same story bits, same like quotes of sayings of Jesus that come specifically from Matthew. So ultimately derived from that. So Ignatius is talking about Jesus as a star, but somehow knows the Gospel of Matthew. Revelation might have a mixture of both things. And then Second Peter definitely knows Matthew because he basically regurgitates the story of the Transfiguration. And then quotes and then says how Jesus is the morning star. So maybe he also knows Revelation. That's not clear. I don't find any firm stances on that in the biblical literature. So the right model is probably, I shouldn't say the right model. The model on the right, is it right? That's the question. The model on the right is probably what most biblical scholars think is going on, a general outline of the sources there. The one on the left is another possibility. Maybe there's actually one source, and all of these different sources actually might go back to this earlier stellar Jesus idea. And I want to see if that's a possibility.
Nice.
I thought I saw some super chats pop up. I didn't know if
there's a bunch of them. I wanted you to get through. If you want, we can do. If you want, we can get to some and then come back. What do you think? I mean, you know the flow of the slide, so I'd rather you decide.
So this might be a good point to pause and let's go through some super chats.
Okay, perfect. That's a good idea. I like that. All right, we'll hold that thought on these models. Good models, by the way. So Gregory Bloomfield has dropped $20 twice because I bought him one of these hats that I'm wearing right now. For some reason, on the Spring app where they make you I have like the clothes, the hats, the certain types of hats that I have on there. I have the shirts, the hoodies. But for some reason, these hats, they're having problems with them. I don't know what it is. They keep getting denied, and I have to remodel them or like fix something. And I'm still working on it, so I'm trying to get them. But I sent him one through the way I got mine, and that's why he did that. But Gregory, thanks for watching. I appreciate that, and thanks for that. Yeah. Robert Herring, $5 says, emergent space, emergent time, emergent gravity. Is emergent entropy a thing? Also, what's the best tracking non-Dob mount for my 16-inch Meade Dobsonian?
You got a Dobsonian. Nice. I am jealous there, buddy. Okay. Emergent space-time is kind of an idea. So when it comes to quantum gravity, there have been a couple different approaches to that. Most basically figure we're going to take Einstein's general theory of relativity and add basically a quantum interpretation on top of it. And there have been lots and lots of attempts at that. Some have also been trying to now go the other way. Can we actually, from quantum mechanics, derive space-time and then from that derive gravity? I think that's what the idea of emergent gravity is that is supposed to be going on there. And also it relates to entropy in that the way that the system evolves is in the same way how thermodynamic systems evolve, that some states are more likely than others, and you'll get more probable states after less probable states. I think that's the basics of what's going on there. But when it comes to the details, this is definitely outside of my physics knowledge, unfortunately. It could be the absolute future. It could be a dead end. I don't know, but it's very exciting ideas.
It's
And as for the Dobsonian, when it comes to mounts, I probably don't have great expertise there. But when it comes to looking for sources, the magazine Sky and Telescope has reviews of telescopes and mounts all the time. I would get a subscription to that, and I'm a little bit biased because they published one of my early articles on the Star of Bethlehem.
Nice. Thanks for the super chat, Robert. Cindy Lamakia, thank you for the super chat. Appreciate that. Do you think Jesus and Inanna are both from a common archetype of the Morningstar, Venus, descending to the underworld to raise the dead? This was early on, so this is a lot before you said a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, so I think not directly. I'm going to argue ultimately in the upcoming slides, the idea of Jesus as the Morningstar can be derived from Jewish scripture, but I also think that the idea here that seems like to fit with the history of religion school, what I think is the best way of approaching that is not so much like copycat religion sort of system, but these are the ideas that are in the air that allow someone searching through the scriptures to basically anchor onto those sorts of things. If you already have this idea in your mind, it's then easier to notice it in other places. In the same sort of way, if I say red Toyota, now tomorrow you're probably going to find a red Toyota, but that car had already been there, probably zoomed by your home hundreds of times over the last few months, but you didn't notice until someone mentioned it.
Right.
So I think that might be a way, an idea of anchoring, which is at least psychologically plausible, and takes what I think is the best from the history of religious school, but also avoid the times it goes a little overboard.
Interesting. Imposter suspense. Why is Lucifer in Isaiah and Ovid's Metamorphosis?
Yeah, so the Lucifer of Metamorphosis is certainly not the evil character, and he's not a fallen king, or definitely not a fallen Babylonian king.
Yeah.
Ultimately, how does Lucifer get into Isaiah? Translation and later interpretation by Christians who are looking for what happened to Satan as he transforms to basically part of God's court, where he is, a prosecutor working with God, to go after people like Job to see if they're righteous enough or not.
Right.
To the ultimate force of evil because of influence from Zoroastrianism. Now, if you think he's evil, he definitely can't be in the court of God, but you see he's in the court, so he must have fallen. How did he fall? Where do you find the evidence for that? Oh, there's this idea of this falling deity of sorts falling from the heavens. That must be our Satan.
Yeah, and I think that we got to keep in mind, Ovid's, a lot of people don't realize this, that Lucifer is before Isaiah's Lucifer. Even though Isaiah is older, Isaiah never mentions Lucifer, he mentions Hillel. That he wasn't thinking about Lucifer the way we think of Lucifer. So you got to keep in mind, Isaiah writes about Hillel, and he's talking like metaphorically about this king of Babylon who falls. Ovid writes about a whole different Lucifer, who's basically a male version of Venus. And then centuries later, when the Latin Bible gets written, they translate Isaiah's Hillel into Lucifer. So, which means the Lucifer of Greek mythology predates the Lucifer of Christianity. That's what I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is a pretty big point for the King James onlyists who have Lucifer in the Bible. So, anyways, let's go to the next one, and then I think there's a couple more. We'll do two more. How about that? Doing two more, then we'll go back.
Your call if you think they work well.
Okay, yeah, because there's one that paid a lot, so I want to get to that one. This one says, "Jesus saves." Yep, well known in my watching my. Thanks for watching. You're always sending me super chats. Jesus is the Morningstar. Revelation 2:28. Not Satan. End of discussion.
Absolutely true. That is definitely what Revelation says. It is definitely clear that Satan is not the Morningstar.
Yeah, I would agree. But then how do you get Lucifer from the Old Testament then?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. It is worth noting, though, that like we already see, like in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says he saw the Satan fall. He already, it seems like by the time the Gospel of Luke is written, Christians are reading the Isaiah 14:12 story as the fall of Satan. So by that time, it's going on. And of course, we see the fall of Satan taking place also in Revelation 12, which we're definitely going to talk about more. And also, I think it then becomes an interesting parallel, because it's worth noting in Isaiah 14, it's not that king of Babylon is the morning star, he's basically saying, I want to be like the morning star and like be, on top of the
Yes.
world, and then
I
he's
was just
thrown
going to
down.
say, you can also make the argument that Satan or Lucifer, whoever, was in heaven, was the highest of the high. He was the court. He was the court district attorney, and he was the morning star. And then he fell, and now Jesus is the morning star. You could
Mhm.
always go that route. That's
Yeah.
a lot to pull there. But yeah, I'm just
Yeah, so there could be
giving
some
Christian.
interesting parallelism where you
Yeah,
have, the false morning star and then the true morning star.
right. I'm just giving Christian something to play with. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for this super chat. Really appreciate it. I need some book references for ancient cosmology and mathematics. Oh, he's asking the right person, by the way, Aaron Adair, who would have thought studying ancient cosmology is all you need to destroy the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. Astrology is also interesting.
All right, so there are several different references you could go for of different levels of readability. So if you want basically a school textbook from antiquity, you want to read Geminus of Rhodes. His Isagoge is basically an introduction to astronomy for people who would, go through formal education and basically, try to work up to become natural philosophers. Uh, and it has like saying like, and here's like some of the technical language that is used. So it's a bit beyond, let's say, for example, Aratus's Phenomena, which is basically this poem that explains the constellations. If you want more technical information and a little bit more of the history of astronomy, Ptolemy's Almagest is probably the source you want to go to. The English translation from Toomer is the one to go with.
All that, obviously, you know more than me, but Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, very
Mhm.
good resource for this. First century BC. There's a copy from Oxford World Classics, the white ones that are behind me, and what's the other one? Oh, this one right here. This right here is amazing.
Hmm.
Do you read that?
Eratosthenes and Hyginus, yes.
Yes. So if you're watching Constellation Pegasus, this you want to get this, dude. You want to go online. It's like $10 on Amazon. Aristophanes and Hyginus, Constellation, and then it also has Aratus Phenomena in it in the back because it's a really short manuscript.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
I can also add on top of that as well. So in Plutarch, in particular, his book On the Faces That Appear in the Moon, that also has a fair bit of discussion of like different astronomical theories and the like. It quotes from many different sources. And of course, then you get to read more Plutarch that way, which is always a good idea.
Yeah. And he also obviously has about mathematics too. That I have no idea.
Yeah. 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 Ptolemy's Almagest has a lot of mathematics in it because he's basically trying to create an entire model for the whole solar system and predict where the stars are going to be at any given point in time. When I say the stars, I also mean the planets, where he has all these complicated planetary theories, and his was basically the standard astronomical book, like to predict and understand the solar system for many centuries.
Did Archimedes write anything down, or is he just a famous person that we know about?
Oh, Archimedes. Well, unfortunately, we have some of his stuff that's left. In particular, it was this really amazing journey for basically his book on method, which there's a great I'm forgetting the name of the title of the book, but it gives pretty much like a journalistic story of like the creation of the book, its transmission, its discovery in the 19th century, its disappearance, and when they discovered it again, someone had actually like painted over the pages that were of the most interest to mathematicians. And then they basically had to use the Stanford Linear Accelerator, SLAC, to produce X-rays to actually then read behind the painting, to read the ink underneath it, and rediscover his old text. And what was one of the things that Archimedes had figured out? Integral calculus. 2,000 years before Newton.
Wow.
He doesn't have, exactly the same sort of thing, but he has the idea of like the infinitesimal as a way of like adding up extremely small bits to get the overall result of finding areas into curves. We basically discovered, hey, he basically had at least some of the basics of calculus 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz.
Wow. So
I forget the name of the book. I think it's just called the Archimedes Codex.
yeah, I think that's yeah. But
I don't know if it's translated into English yet. It's been a really long work in progress.
right. Good question. But yeah, look out for that one. And that's probably enough. I think he can start with and go from
Yeah.
there. We got 2 more supers, and then we'll get to the rest of your slides.
Cool.
Apollo Zagreus. Doesn't Apollyon cast Satan in the abyss? I'm not sure if that's how it is, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think, yeah, Apollyon is one of the words that's used in Revelation, but my memory isn't helping me very well right now, the details. Because I think you're right. Apollyon locks Satan into the abyss where he stays for 1,000 years, and then he gets one last chance to get pop out and get his butt kicked for the final time.
Yeah, I thought, wasn't Apollyon one of the names of the beast? But I could be wrong.
Yeah. I'm a little bit fuzzy on that point. I'd have to pull open my Bible and check. But
all I would say, Apollo Zagreus, is go to Revelation 18, and yeah, I think that's the one, Revelation 18, or is it right before that? Yeah, just read the last couple chapters of Revelation. You'll see it in there. But yeah, that's a good question.
Mhm.
Next, the last one, and then we'll get back to and we'll finish the slides up. Mummy Veil. Who is the child who's born to the woman in Revelation 12? Christ or the Antichrist? Is Nero the child who was to rule?
Ooh, you want me to move my slides forward, don't you?
Is this where you're getting at?
Oh.
Well, then let's let you do your thing then.
All right then. So
we'll just say this is the question of all questions and put it
all
up
right.
in heavens.
So we're going to explore the 2 different models here, but we also need to explain the idea of a stellar morning star Jesus in the first place. How does one possibly get that idea? We already see that there are examples of it in Jewish literature. It's applied to Jesus. How do we get there? What are they reading from the Old Testament? Because the only real mention of the morning star directly in the Old Testament is, Isaiah 14, where it's the fall of the morning star. Definitely doesn't look like Jesus to me. So we need some technique to approach this, and I think I might have a solution with what's called the Pesher method, where we see this a lot in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You take 2, maybe 3 different verses together that have maybe a thematic connection or a vocabulary connection. You bring them together, and then you get new theological insights. We see that throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see it in the Christian literature, and I think we can see it maybe explaining some details. So, in particular, what I'm going to propose is a connection between Psalm 110 and the star prophecy of Numbers 24:17. So the reason I think it might be worth connecting is it looks like in Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews in book 7 or chapter 7 of that, there's this long, discussion of Psalm 110, or in the Septuagint Psalm 109, where they're talking about the new priesthood that Jesus is going to be part of, the Melchizedekian priesthood. And in Hebrews 7:14, it talks about how Jesus will be a descendant of David. The interesting thing is the verb he uses seems to indicate he's actually citing Numbers 24:17 in a loose way. He uses a verb that's really weird to use if you're talking about the birth of a person. The verb is anatelo, like the rising of a star. And that word is used in Numbers 24:17 for the rising of the star coming out of Jacob, which is usually interpreted as supposed to be David, being that king.
Right.
So it looks like the author of Hebrews is already in the background thinking about Numbers 24:17 while discussing Psalm 110. Now, what's interesting about Psalm 110? So first off, like he's really big on the order of Melchizedek, who is also an interesting name. It out of Hebrew literally means like righteous king, but he's also a priest, king and priest, like a Jesus. Ooh.
Right.
And in Psalm 110,
which is why in the book of Hebrews they mention the order of Melchizedek, and they call him a type of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, exactly. And interestingly enough, in Psalm 110, verse 3, it's describing the birth of the king, especially like in the reconstruction of the Hebrew that I've mentioned in a previous video. It seems to talk about the king who was born from the womb of dawn.
Oh.
So if you are combining the star prophecy,
I didn't know that,
with this, you have a star born of dawn. And mind you, the person born from this is supposed to be both basically king, because this is like the birth of God's chosen ruler for Israel, and he's also of the order of Melchizedek, a priest, king and priest. We already saw before the morning star was a king and priest figure. we can now see why that might be if it's derived in this way, a combination of Psalm 110 and the star prophecy.
The version I got right here, it's from the Catholic Bible. It says,
Hmm.
"In the holy splendor of the day star, like Melchizedek, you are a priest forever." Day star. That's another word for that's what that word means.
Yeah. Now, it is worth noting that the Hebrew as is in the Masoretic text is almost uninterpretable.
Yeah,
Like
right.
the vowel pointing is almost impossible to understand.
Exactly.
The Septuagint version also differs differently or weirdly. The reconstruction that Robert Cargill has given, I find the most convincing right now, and it basically says, you know, the King of Israel will be born of the womb of dawn and will be the begotten Son of Almighty God. In the same way it says in Psalm 2:7, on this day you are my son, I've begotten you.
That's a really good point that you're bringing up. That whoever wrote Revelation 12 was clearly looking at Psalm 110. Clearly, if you, I mean, I'll just take the two and put them next to each other, and you'll see it. You'll see it. It's like the sequence and everything is all there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like I say, though, this is my proposal of maybe how the works. It would explain the details of how the Morningstar figures are described in other Jewish literature. But now this also brings up a question. If this is about the birth of the Morningstar, what would that look like? If you are trying to visualize this Pesher, what would that look like? If you were born of dawn, it already sounds like you're in a heavenly setting. If you were a star born in heaven, maybe it would look something like this.
Wow.
Obviously, I'm choosing my imagery very
No, I like that. I like that.
straightforwardly. So maybe it would look like if you are, a dawn goddess, you are in space, maybe like at the moon. And of course, if you're a goddess of some sort, you're also giving birth to a regal figure. You better be a queen yourself. You better be wearing a crown. And of course, if you're a dawn goddess, you're going to be glowing like dawn itself. In other words, this imagery starts immediately making you think Revelation 12.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm thinking it's like, wow, this Pesher might not just explain this title, but it might even explain the imagery of Revelation 12. Now, in particular, it's worth noting, right before the first sighting of the woman, what happens before that? The temple in heaven opens up and makes loud sounds, bright light pops out, and then you see the woman. It's almost like she's emerging from the temple.
Yeah.
And we are then told she is clothed with the sun, wearing a crown of stars. And interestingly, in Second Enoch, when it describes the sun, when the sun is rising, it says the sun puts on a crown at rising. So this imagery makes sense. The moon at her feet. This also makes sense if she has come out of the heavenly temple and now she's at the moon, which is the border basically between the heavenly realm and the unheavenly realm.
By the way, if you were a Jew living in Israel or whatever, anyway, I don't know, anywhere, and somebody came to you with this scripture right here, you would be like, that is some pagan shit right there. Like, there's no way they'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. But what's interesting about the Christians and the early Christian literature is, it, as much as it comes off as like sort of pagany, it's rooted in the Psalms. Like they really are marrying the two together in a way that's like pretty fascinating. And I can't lie, like it's pretty well. This is why I think they're not just a bunch of idiots in the goat herders that are living in the desert. Like there's no way.
Yeah.
I know that's a popular opinion on most. I just don't buy that anymore. The more I get into this stuff, I'm like, this is some really intricate, deep level stuff that they're writing here.
Oh yeah. You cannot be an illiterate goat herder and create these sorts of stories. This requires education, deep thought, reflection. It might not be right, but you can see that there's a brilliant thought process.
Exactly. Like there are just moments where you're like, wow, that didn't really pan out well for them. Like, but they said this, but this actually happened. But the thought process behind it is extremely high level. If that makes sense.
Right. All right. So here's a few other things that I've also realized along the way. So this scene taking place in heaven. So the heavenly setting is clear because, it says it's a sign in heaven. If she's standing on the moon, if the moon is at her feet, she's then basically literally at the border between the heavenly realm and the lower realm. Like usually the moon is like considered like the barrier between like the firmament and like the first heaven. Which then, of course, would also make sense if we're told Satan is also in the sky, but somehow can't quite get to this woman because, it says that Satan, or like the dragon there, wants to consume the child, but somehow can't. Well, what if it's because she's basically literally behind the heavenly wall? She's on one side of the boundary. Now, the other thing is, in Revelation 12, there's also saying how she's pregnant with a king, and it quotes Psalm 2, verse 9. Here's what's interesting about that. Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 are both considered coronation psalms. They were supposed to be part of the coronation process for the Jewish king, and we think they're very ancient. They were commonly read together. Again, in Hebrews, we actually see the two being like cited right one after the other, citing them both together. And earlier in the book of Revelation, in chapter 2 of that, there is first this quote of Psalm 2:9, the same thing that's quoted here, and then saying how Jesus, and then brings up the morning star. And also in 2 Peter, that is, someone pretending to be Peter. He's describing the transfiguration, but what he quotes is Psalm 2:7, and then mentions Jesus, the morning star. In other words, Psalm 2, morning star. Psalm 2, morning star. What's happening here in Revelation 12? Psalm 2 is cited, birth of the morning star.
Wow.
And also, it looks like Psalm 110 is a big part of this because not only does it then say how the child is then brought up to heaven and to sit at the right-hand side of God, isn't that exactly how Psalm 110 starts, where he says,
Psalm 110 says, rule over your enemies. Yours is princely power from the day of your birth.
Yep.
And then he says, in your holy splendor, the morning star. Like Melchizedek. Like, it's all there.
And in verse 1, it says, sit at my right-hand side, which is exactly what this baby Jesus does. He ascends right up to heaven right after this birth. And then right after that, there's a war in heaven. If you read the last part of Psalm 110, it sounds like basically the king going to war and like cracking lots of heads. And guess what? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, in 11Q Melchizedek, one of these Dead Sea Scrolls, it looks like all this discussion of Melchizedek and discussions of Psalm 110, and it also includes a war in heaven against Belial, led by Michael, the archangel. Right. Again, exactly what happens here.
Completely forgot about that. That's got to be that's what the genre was from, let's say, 200 BC. All right, let's say the Seleucid period to about 200 AD. This was like the thing. This was like the pop music. This was like the end crowd was doing this. They're making all these apocalyptic wars in heaven literature of Michael, the prince, or the Messiah, or the battles between light and darkness and all that stuff. That was like, and that's another reason why you cannot date Daniel past 200 BC. You can't. Like, you can't. Right. It fits right in. It literally fits right in like a glove. It's like taking a song from the 80s. Think of the most 80s song you can think of. Like the most pop rock song from the 80s. Cocaine sound and music. Like, you know what I'm talking about? That, the 80s sound. Imagine if someone was like, yeah, this is from the year 500 AD. You'd be like, get the hell out of here. It's got rock and roll in it. And like, what are you talking about? It's not from 500 BC. This is from 1975. That's what it's like when you try to date Daniel.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
it'd be like saying someone found an old lost play of Shakespeare and it has a character say, "Yo, dog, what's up?"
Right. That's exactly what it is, man. Like, it's just obvious.
Yeah. All right. So at this point, it looks like Psalm 110 explains a lot of the interesting details in Revelation 12. It explains the birth from a dawn goddess. It explains a war in heaven. It explains this figure ascending to the throne with God. And the interesting thing is, it seems like there also might be some details that are an interesting combination. So the woman has the moon at her feet. She's clothed with the sun, and I think she's giving birth to the morning star. This combination of sun, moon, and morning star is also seen. Again, I mentioned the book of Sirach in what chapter was that? Chapter 50. The interesting thing is this combination of comparing the priest that's emerging from the temple on Yom Kippur, who is atoning for sin, by the way, just like
Oh, wow.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah. This person leaves there and he's compared to the sun, the moon, and the morning star. It's
Wow.
an interesting combination. And in fact, archaeologically,
You
it's a
said this is
really
in
interesting
Sirach?
combination. Yes, Sirach, chapter 50. And this combination of sun, moon, and bright star also appears in this interesting bit of archaeology.
Wow.
So this is from a catacomb in Rome. It's underneath a villa. It's dated, I've usually seen it's dated to the 3rd century AD. You can tell it's Jewish because you
By
see
the
the
way,
two menorahs.
the author's name is Jesus too.
Oh,
Jesus.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jesus leaving the temple on Yom Kippur after doing sacrifices for sin.
Wow.
Sound familiar? And also compared to the morning star. And also in this bit of archaeology, we see here the two menorahs here, so we can definitely tell it's a Jewish setting. In the middle,
Also written in the same time period, 200 to
Hmm.
175 BC.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it fits the genre. It fits. You could
Oh, yeah.
you're putting it all together. As you could tell.
Hmm. And so the interesting thing here I've noticed with this, so in the middle, it looks like the Holy of Holies. It's opened up. It's kind of hard to tell. It's a little bit damaged, but in there, it looks like there's a bunch of scrolls. It's the sacred text of the Jews. So we have the Holy of Holies opened up. Basically, it's the temple open, like something is coming out of the temple. And on the left and right above that Holy of Holies, you see the sun on one side, the moon on the other, obscured a bit with clouds. And right above that, an 8-pointed star.
Yes, that's the Venus. That's the Ishtar symbol, right?
So if you're going to depict the morning star, it almost is always an 8-pointed
Always.
star. Other stars can also be depicted with 8 points, but basically, if you're trying to represent the morning star, it has to be 8-pointed, basically.
Yeah. By the way,
So it's not like a slam dunk morning star, but it fits exactly the description in the book of Sirach.
By the way, a lot of the early Middle Ages artists. Now before anyone crucifies me for saying this, I'm fully aware. I'm not stupid. I fully aware that every artist is their own thing. So it's not like the church made all these paintings. They're all separate artists. I get that, okay, but just look in the middle. Look at her medallion. There's the 8-pointed star. It almost seems like a lot of the early paintings, even medieval painting, even later on, there's always some sort of an attempt to identify Mary with the 8-pointed star of Venus, which I think is from Revelation 12. Maybe that's a thing. But then you'd have to argue, how did all the artists know this? And you have to look into where the artists are coming from, who's funding the artist.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm just throwing that out there for thought for people to think about. Like, I think it's interesting.
All right. Yeah, that is also a very good observation.
Yeah.
I'll make a couple more as well about this catacomb. So the fact that it shows the sun and moon a bit obscured behind clouds, but only that star above it seems to be big, bright, and unobscured. That seems to actually be derived, at least the commentaries I've read, derived from Isaiah 60, 19 and 20, where it says that basically in the new holy Jerusalem, there will be no need for the sun or moon, that God will provide the light. And so that seems to be what's going on here. The sun and moon are obscure. They're no longer necessary. The true bright light of the Almighty is what we need. And also, this same sort of sentiment you can find in Revelation 21, where it says, in the new heavenly Jerusalem, there is no sun or moon, for Jesus as the great lamp will provide the light for this world. By the way, Jesus is the morning star.
Right.
So this powerful combination, and again, this is an opening of a temple, and then you have sun, moon, and morning star. Again, what happened in chapters 11 and 12? The temple opens up. This woman appears with the sun, moon imagery, and then seems to be giving birth to the morning star. All the imagery seems to fit together extremely well.
Right.
So this is the stuff that gets me excited and think I might be, well, I am crazy, but I might be on a right track while being crazy.
Now, you said you're bringing this to peer review, some of this stuff that you want to present.
Yeah, so this particular argument about Revelation 12 and the Pesher behind it of Psalm 110 and the star prophecy, that I'm going to be presenting in November at SBL this year.
Wow. Good luck.
And then I'll find out if people say, okay, that's interesting versus that's boring versus here are 10 things you are totally wrong about.
Yeah, that's how this thing works, man.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm presenting it now. So if anyone in the scholarly community is out there watching this, again, get in touch with me to give criticism or anything else because I need it. I want it. If I'm totally wrong, I'm happy to trash this. But I think the evidence is at least enough to say it's plausible to keep examining.
Look, man, there's nothing better than putting it out there, testing a hypothesis. When I started this channel, not even a year ago, last summer in July, I had some crazy, wild opinions and ideas and hypotheses that I thought were good. I was very into Roman Providence stuff, Vespasian stuff, all that. I was just all over the place. And I by throwing myself out there to the public to be tested and commented on and debated, it couldn't have been a better thing that ever you learn that way.
I agree. I agree.
I mean,
I have won so many arguments with shampoo bottles in the shower, but that is not translated to the real world.
right. That's a fact. I just pictured Billy Madison right there.
Yeah. Now you're making me think of actual good Adam Sandler movies. Okay. All right. So I think at least I have a good hypothesis for where the imagery of the Morningstar comes from this Pesher method. It can explain what is going on in Revelation, but still there is the question then, how might it also relate to our other sources? So in particular, how does it relate to Ignatius and Jesus as a star? How does it relate to the Star of Bethlehem and the Gospel of Matthew? So again, this is in this slide here showing the two. No. You actually you read my mind and went ahead correctly. So so we both proved the Pesher behind this, and we proved the existence of psychic powers.
Nice.
It's a good night.
Yes.
Breakthroughs. All right. So again, we have our two major hypotheses of how this might work. That there's maybe two disparate ideas of stars related to Jesus. The one we find in Matthew and then the one we find in Revelation, and they're ultimately separate in some way or form. So to answer this question of which of these models might be correct, is it really the case that maybe they all go back to a singular one? We need to get into source criticism. So I have some of the issues with at least earlier attempts at source criticism to read the Gospels and try to figure out all the different sources they had. So I read more and more of the Gospels being very inventive, being very creative. They don't need to say, well, this was said by such and such in the oral literature or the oral storytelling, and I'm going to incorporate it into mine. More and more, I see them being too clever to just hear whispers and then write them down. They seem to be much more methodical than that, especially the way Matthew structures things. So the idea of form criticism and that usually has this idea of this oral transmission, and then it gets stitched together by the gospel authors. I've had issues with that. But another way of doing source criticism is comparing the sources we actually have and then try to derive what's their relationship. That is with texts we do have rather than hypothetical texts that we try to reconstruct. And if we do that, I think we can find some interesting results. And by the way, this isn't my results, what I'm going to show here. This is actually what seems to be the majority of the literature on the subject. So in particular, the relationship between Ignatius and Matthew. Again, there's a lot of stuff that's in common between the letters of Ignatius, who was a bishop of Antioch. We think it's the same town that Matthew was writing in part because they have so much in common. Sometimes absolutely verbatim stuff. Ignatius is the first person to mention the virgin birth of Jesus. There's things that look like exact quotes from the Gospel of Matthew. But the interesting thing is, since the 1950s, study after study has looked at this and said the best conclusion is that Ignatius is not actually using the Gospel of Matthew.
Really?
But he knows Matthew's sources. And the interesting thing is, if we then look at what Ignatius says about this star, it has nothing to do, it seems like, with the birth of Jesus and Herod and all the things that we have from the Nativity story. What it says in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 19 or section 19, it talks about first how things were being kept hidden from the devil. And these things included Jesus's birth, his virgin birth, his passion. All these things were supposed to be kept hidden. And then finally, he is revealed to the world. And how is he finally revealed? As this star where the sun, moon, and other stars are dancing around them and singing in chorus to the bright new star that has come and has now basically completely upset the entire universe and all the demonic powers. That is what Ignatius says in what's called the Star Hymn in chapter 19 of his letter to the Ephesians. Obviously, it sounds absolutely nothing like what happens in the Bethlehem story.
Right.
And on the other hand, when it comes to Revelation, the first instinct might say, hey, there are a lot of places where there seem to be almost exact quotes between Revelation and specifically the Gospel of Matthew. But again, I've actually found that most of the major studies on this, the ones that are in depth on this, come to the conclusion that Revelation is not using Matthew as a source. Again, they seem to be using common sources or common traditions.
Yeah.
Now, what does John say about Jesus as a star? Well, he definitely upsets, the demonic forces. He, absolutely, defeats Satan at the end. But the interesting thing as well to note in Revelation 12, where it seems to be depicting the birth of Jesus, I don't think that's the birth of Jesus.
Really?
It's the rebirth.
Explain.
When Jesus became the Son of God, according to Paul in Romans 1:14, he became the Son of God because of his resurrection from the dead.
Oh.
Jesus is born again.
So what was he? How was he? He wasn't alive. He was alive before that. Then you're saying?
So it's worth noting, like before you get to Revelation 12, you have all these descriptions of the lamb who had been sacrificed, whose neck was broken, who was bleeding, and then does all these rituals within the holy temple as sin sacrifice. In other words, doing the Yom Kippur ritual as the lamb who had been slain.
Oh.
Everything up to Revelation 12 looks like Jesus has already died,
Okay.
and now he's performing the final rituals in the Holy of Holies before emerging. And it's also worth noting, in Hebrews, it's specific and says that Jesus entered the temple only one time entered the holy temple, the heavenly temple, to offer his blood for sacrifice, and then left that forever. What happens in Revelation 11? The temple in heaven blows open. Then you see the woman giving birth after Jesus had already done all these other sacrifice things. I think the imagery here is not the birth of Jesus, because why is Jesus being born at the moon? But this is being resurrected and ascending in heaven.
Okay, I get what you're saying now. It makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, so I think that fits Revelation and the imagery there, and like Paul's theology, what's said in the Epistle of the Hebrews, it fits that context, I think, overall better. It's also then a bit weird if it were actually the birth of Jesus, because according to, for example, Ignatius, the birth of Jesus was hidden from Satan. In Revelation 12, Satan clearly knows what's up. He is trying to devour the child that's about to be born. That's definitely not hidden.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Ignatius says the way that Jesus became known was by becoming this bright star and upsetting all of heaven. So to me, I'm looking at this and saying, hey, it's the same myth. It's about the resurrected Jesus as a star.
Right.
You also find the same thing in the Ascension of Isaiah, that when Jesus is descending, he has to hide himself and look homely as a human. But after his death, when he comes back to life, he will no longer look like a human. He will transform back into his much more elegant, angelic, stellar body.
Okay. Makes sense.
So this seems to be what is the common myth, that it seems like Revelation Ignatius have some sort of underlying source or theology where Jesus becomes a star or appears as a star, and specifically the morning star, at his resurrection. And then in that he upsets the demonic powers and basically brings the end of the world eventually. And also, again, all those other studies suggesting that Revelation and Matthew have a common source. Ignatius and Matthew have a common source. If this source is in common with Revelation and Matthew, or sorry, in Revelation and Ignatius, and these two sources seem to have common sources with Matthew, that ups the probability a lot that Matthew could be using the exact same source as well for his story.
So are you hinting at a Q type of thing or a mark?
So it'd be more Q in that case, because it's not derived from Mark.
Okay.
Yeah. Though the big difference is, unlike Q, where it's reconstruction based on arguments whether Matthew knew Luke or not. In these cases, I'm building on the other studies that do suggest that Revelation and Ignatius aren't using Matthew, may not even know the Gospel of Matthew, but since they have these commonalities, they must have some sort of common theological source behind there.
Okay.
So, and like I say, these studies were mostly independent on the whole Jesus as star story. It's many other quotes that they look to and say similarities, but not common sourcing.
Gotcha.
So, building on that, it makes it seem like, okay, if Revelation and Ignatius are telling the same story about Jesus as a morning star upsetting, demonic forces, could Matthew be deriving from that as well? Now, obviously, Matthew's story is very different, but I think he kind of gives the game away. And it's a phrase that, honestly, I had ignored for the longest time until I realized how it's actually important. The Magi, when they are coming, they say they have seen his star at its rising or at its morning rising.
There's that
His
coin that I was
star.
showing.
Oh, yeah, we got some coins, of course. Now, oh, yeah.
That's Venus. That's the 8-pointed star of Venus. By the
Right.
way, a lot of the coins that are also the same as this have the two that are lateral too. Or I'm sorry, horizontal. I said that.
Yeah.
So they have the whole eights. In this particular one, it's the Divius Ilias that is the horizontal ones. But yeah, you can see them up there.
Yep, I have a collection of there. Some of them are for Julius Caesar, and some of them are for Caesar Augustus.
Right.
Where he also is divinized as a star.
Yeah. And by the way, I just found this out. At the Vatican, there is an Egyptian obelisk from Egypt that they brought. They literally took this thing all the way from Egypt. Must have been an insane job to do that. To try not to break this thing. Anyways, they did it, and the obelisk sitting in the middle of St. Peter's Square has on it the divine Julius, the son divine Ilias, or divine Augustus, or I think it says Octavian or something. Anyways, it's got divine Julius, divine Octavian, and then the son of the son Tiberius, son of God. So Tiberius is now the son of God in that time period. He's the one who brought, and the story goes that Julius Caesar is the one who went to the Battle of Actium. No, not the Battle of Actium. Augustus, Battle of Actium, defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He finds that obelisk, says this is now Rome's obelisk, but he doesn't take it back right away. He leaves it in Egypt for like 60 years or something like that. Tiberius is the one who goes and brings it back to Rome, puts it in front of the Vatican. And then later on, there's a legend that I don't think is true. I don't think anyone even believes it. But the story is that St. Peter was hung on that obelisk. The cross that he was killed on was on that obelisk. So it's like, think about all the things that tie into this. The rock of the church. So you got an obelisk. You have Peter getting crucified on this obelisk. It's from Egypt. I don't know. There's a lot of weird thoughts that come to my head when I think of this. But I don't think Peter actually did get killed on that thing. I think it's just a later legend.
Yeah, I would probably guess that's a later legend too. But the idea, of course, Peter being the rock and he's hung from this rock obelisk, it seems like the sort of
Where the church
poetic
is, by the way. Yeah, just happens to be where the church is, the Vatican.
Yeah, it seems like that's like how such a myth would be created. Somebody starts with basically a pun, and then the pun becomes real.
Yes, and that's I think a lot of Christian stories are brought up that way.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, all right. Oh, so yeah, calling the Star of Bethlehem his star, the star of Jesus. The thing that set me off, and I realized there was something weird there, because that's not something you would see in something in astrology. In an astrological text, it never talks about a person having a star in their horoscope, or they point to a star and say that this is, this person's or that person's star per se. This is actually rather weird. And the examples of where I find this particular construction of talking about, like, saying this is the star of this person, or this is his or her star, I could only find a couple examples of that when it comes to people. One of them is with Julius Caesar, the star that's seen after his death. It is called Caesar's star. In Virgil's Aeneid, it's called the star of the father, because it's talking about Augustus. So this is the star of his father, Julius Caesar.
And by the way, when you read Ovid's Metamorphoses, he makes it clear that Julius Caesar became a god, ascended into heaven. He's on his funeral pyre. He's raised up by Venus and brought onto his throne. And then right then and there, because of his will, the will of Julius Caesar is to beget his son, who is Octavian. So Augustus is begotten by God.
Mm-hmm. Now, the thing also worth noting, all these times that they're talking about Caesar's star or his star, it's also worth noting, remember that according to the Roman propaganda, that star wasn't just a star to represent Caesar, that star was Caesar. That was his soul ascending to heaven.
Yes, yep. That's crazy.
And if you go about 150 or so years later, you find another figure named Antinous. This was a young lover of the Emperor Hadrian.
Yes.
And on a trip,
deified. He was deified too.
yeah. The basic story was he was taking a pleasure trip with Hadrian on the Nile in Egypt. Somehow he falls into the Nile and drowns. And Hadrian is just so distraught. He's being comforted by like the priests that are with him, and they say, "Look up! We see that there's a new star in the sky. That's Antinous' soul rising to heaven. He's become a god."
Wow.
And again, the construction there, it refers to that star as the star of Antinous. It uses this same sort of construction to say it was star of this person. But again, according to our sources like Cassius Dio, that star was said to actually be the soul of Antinous.
Wow.
So when you see someone say his star, that should make you think that person is that star.
Right.
You also find the same thing if we go back to Jewish literature. So in the Testament of Levi, it talks also about this bright star who's supposed to be the high priest that's going to, bring all the good things to the world. And again, it referred to as his star, the star of the priest. The priest is this bright star, and that is the star of the priest. So when you say his star or the star of that person, you are saying that star is the person. This is also the common interpretation of Numbers 24:17. It's clearly talking about a king or Messiah figure there, and that's how it's understood in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's how it was understood in the Bar Kokhba revolt. The star in that prophecy is a person. So if the star prophecy is, behind what's going on here, if everyone thinks, Matthew is using the star prophecy, but the star is supposed to be a person, then it really seems to be ringing all the bells to say when it says the star of Jesus, it's saying the star is Jesus, which some Christians actually did interpret that.
Sure, why not?
So this is kind of giving away the game that Matthew is deriving from this earlier source that has Jesus as the bright morning star.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so it looks like, Revelation and Ignatius are both talking about a bright morning star upsetting the cosmic balance. In Matthew's story, there's a bright morning star that is supposed to be the star of Jesus, and of course it causes all sorts of consternation when the Magi show up.
Sure.
So to me, it looks like it's the same source being used in all these three places. So I think the model on the left is the most conformant with the studies on the relationship between Matthew, Revelation, and Ignatius. And as for 2 Peter, which also mentions Jesus as the morning star, I am very sure that 2 Peter knows the Gospels because he's basically quoting from the Transfiguration story. So he almost certainly knows the Gospel of Matthew. And the fact that he calls Jesus the morning star, that he also cites Psalm 2 after that, just like John of Patmos did, I would say more likely than not, 2 Peter is also using Revelation as inspiration, if not a source.
Makes sense.
So this, I think, then is the model that it all goes back to this earlier myth of Jesus as a star. Now, if this is true, though, this actually makes something a bit interesting. Matthew's star is clearly not acting as Jesus. It's supposed to still be separate from him, acting as this guide. So what this looks like is Matthew knows the earlier source, and now he has euhemerized it.
That's your argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ah, I caught you. No,
You got me.
that's a good argument, though. I like that. It makes sense. It would be big for mythicists, so this is true.
When it comes to that, there are a few things to note. I honestly don't think this changes the arguments for mythicism that much for a few reasons. One, because I'm arguing that the nativity story is even less historical, doesn't really change things because most
I
Bible
got you.
scholars already figured this isn't historical. It's
Sure.
not like I've proven the crucifixion didn't happen. That's not what's happened here.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and most importantly, I think that you could still believe that this story is euhemerized and this fits that model of taking cosmic myths and putting them on Earth, but still think there's an historical person if you think Paul is talking about an historical Jesus.
Sure.
Basically, the model could be that Jesus was a dude. He was effectively deified very quickly by the time Paul comes on board. Myths are created about the deified Jesus, and then the later gospel authors then start taking those myths and putting them on Earth.
Sure.
This would mean the gospels have very, very little connection to the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
But it would still be consistent with there being a historical Jesus. So ultimately, this argument can't prove mythicism.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think it does justify, for example, Richard Carey's idea that the Gospels are euhemerizations of Christ's myth. If I can show this is like one example and say, hey, here's the earlier source, we can derive it from these other non-gospel sources, and then see how Matthew has euhemerized it, then it makes it much more plausible that that's the sort of strategy the gospel authors did have. It won't prove mythicism. What it would do is just show that that premise that Carey uses is justified.
Sure.
So ultimately, though, if you want to argue mythicism, you're going to basically have to argue, how do you interpret Paul? How does Josephus fit into it?
Yeah.
That's, I think, where the argument has to be.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're going to be a mythicist, you need explanations like this to explain our sources and their relationships.
Yeah, that's definitely strengthens it a little bit. So we got 2 more super chats,
Awesome.
and then we can close this out. Gaius Julius Windex, thank you for the super chat. Why did Herod know about Jesus' location, and why would he knowingly kill the Messiah if he's a Jew? That's a good question.
Well, it is worth noting that it seems the thing that bothered Herod was when the Magi came and they said they're looking for the king of the Jews, which would basically say, hey, these guys are looking for my replacement. I don't want to be replaced.
Right, but I guess the question is if he's really a devout Jew, which I guess maybe he's not. Maybe that's your argument if you're a Christian. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's an atheist, and we just don't know. But
on the other hand,
if he is a devout Jew, then why would he want to go and kill the Messiah, knowing he's going to be going against God? Like, that doesn't make sense either. So,
on the other hand, this actually leads to something else a bit interesting. So, if the nativity story, at least the Bethlehem part of the nativity story, is a euhemerization of this Jesus as star myth, where does Satan fit into it? Well, Herod would have to fit that role.
Right. Which he does, which is why you have Pharaoh, which is why you have, the Babylonian Nimrod. He's like the new version of that. He's the new Satan, the accuser. You know what's funny about this, though, is that when I found out about the Herod story and I started reading Josephus looking for something historical, like, is there really an event that Herod went and tried to slaughter babies, which didn't happen, doesn't exist. But oddly enough, most people don't talk about this. There is a story in which Herod does kill some. Some of them were babies, not all of them. Some of them are grown men too. But he does go out and kill some people in his own family because he finds out that Hillel the elder, who's working with the I think the Pharisees, I'm not sure, whatever. He's in this new school of Judaism, and they're like a really philosophical sect of Judaism. I think it's the Pharisees, but he thinks that they're plotting against him. And not only does he think he thinks Hillel is plotting with his own sons and nephews and uncles and people in his own family that have heir to his kingdom. So what he does is he goes around and kills his own sons and some of his family members, and some of them are babies, to prevent a coup of happening. So there is something that does happen regarding Herod. So it's just it has nothing to do with, and this is way before 4 BC, by the way.
Right. Yeah. So like, towards the end of his life, in particular, he takes his paranoia that he had pretty much throughout his life and cranked it up to 11. Right. And he executes several of his sons. He executes his wife. He's constantly thinking people are plotting. He's torturing people to get confessions out of them. He thinks like the Parthian king is involved in attempts to poison him.
Yeah.
By the end of his life, by the time the Magi are supposed to be showing up in the story, he is probably the most paranoid person in that part of the world.
And what I found interesting about that story is the fact that Hillel the Elder is tied to it. And Hillel, if you know anything about Hillel the Elder, his famous teaching is that the Torah can be allegorized in one sentence: do to your neighbor what you would do to yourself. That is the whole Torah. Everything else is just commentary. Basically, he's saying the Torah is the golden rule, which I don't know where he's getting that from. I don't know how he's drawing that conclusion. But anyways, that's what he says, and which is fine. It's good. I respect that. I think that's a great teaching. But it's interesting how Herod is opposed there. He's opposing Herod, and there's no Jesus. There's no Jesus in the story. It's Hillel. Like I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if there's something going on there with people remembering this story or something,
Yeah. Oh, one last thing actually with Gaius Windex's comment as well.
Sure.
It's also worth noting that in the nativity story, it's not just Herod who's also upset about the coming of the Magi. It says that Herod was troubled and all of Jerusalem with him. And then, of course, later on, who are the enemies of Jesus? It's basically the scribes, the Pharisees, who also rile up the crowds against Jesus. It's basically part of the greater narrative that the Jewish elite are basically completely corrupt and need to be left aside for the true inheritors of the God of the Jews.
That
so
makes sense.
So it's part of, I think, Matthew's larger thing. So he clearly is making Herod into a very bad Jew, and the only good Jews are the Christians.
Right. Critical Faculty, good friend, go subscribe to Critical Faculty. He has great guests on, talk about tons of different topics from science to religion to philosophy. He says, just a hello to my friend Neil and an appreciation of your efforts. And Aaron. Thank you.
I'm an effort. Thank you.
I think there's one more that just popped up.
Cool.
I think I saw it. And it is, it's Susie Bailey Kabuti. Good to see you, Susie. It's always good to see you in here. Thank you for that super sticker. I really appreciate it. And so I always love seeing your face in the chat. Definitely keep coming. Definitely. I think that's it. Anything else you want to say?
Thank you for giving me the time to present these ideas. Like I say, I'll be presenting at least some of this in several months to other Bible scholars. But in the meanwhile, I really appreciate you guys paying attention to what I've said, and I look forward to interactions and see if this idea can grow, if it has problems, if there's other evidences that I've missed that will either improve, undermine, or modify this. It's basically, let's do the scholarly process together.
Absolutely. I love it. It's fun to me. So you have all just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over